Michael, thank you so much for your time today. We're going to have a conversation about the self and how having a strong sense of self can be an advantage. So let's start with, what is your concept of the self and why is it important?
Well, I've been doing interviews for the past 60 years and nobody has ever asked me this question. And it's not something that I've ever paused much to think about. But when you do think about it, it's the phenomenon of the fact that you are alone with yourself as an individual, with humanity, rationality, and some irrationality, and you spend an awful lot of time with yourself and with others, but you've spent more time with yourself than you do really with others, and therefore self to me is my rational self sitting outside me and looking backwards and looking into me and looking at the features that are important in my life and in the life of humanity around me. And it's therefore the relationship of an individual with the various groups with which the individual must react, and also with humanity, the whole wondrous universe and the magnificent art and poetry and music that we take for granted. But thinking about yourself makes you realise what a precious gift rationality and life is. And so that's my notion of self. And I think I've got a pretty strong view about my own self.
And in your work as Australia's longest serving judge and all of the various other leadership positions that you hold in academia and also, in international politics, how has your sense of self manifest in the way that you relate to others?
Well, when I was a child, I grew up in a very loving family relationship, and I therefore didn't really feel threatened about myself. And I felt rather good about myself because right from the very beginning, I was pretty good at school. In fact, I was a very, very nerdy type of swot. And therefore I felt confident about myself. In New South Wales, we have a system in the public education system, which I was a student in, of selective schools, the Opportunity C class. And I was whisked away in my fourth year to spend my fifth and sixth year in an OC class. And I therefore knew that somebody with authority had decided that I was a bright kid and that I should be given some extra teaching and extra encouragement. Then I went to Fort Street High School, which is the oldest public school in Australia still functioning, and it's got a very great reputation. I was surrounded by the history of the students of the school, and that also gave me a sense of self and of confidence in myself. This was a very special preparation. I was asked by somebody who came from the Department of Education, what do you want to be when you grow up? I was then about age, I suppose, about 8 or so. And I said, I want to be a judge or a bishop. One way or the other, I was determined to get into fancy dress. And indeed I did. I didn't become a bishop because I wasn't holy enough, but I became a judge, and I served in the judiciary for 34 years. I'm not now a judge, and I spent a lot of time in that vocation, and it's a very important and honourable vocation, but I now do other things and keep with me my sense of confidence. Nothing would be worse than a judge who can't have the confidence to make hard and sometimes unpleasant decisions. But we have to have it, and I had it, and I've done it, but now I'm on to different things.
And so, thank you for that. And I think, you know, those ingredients of confidence from childhood and having, you know, not having that sense of self-threatened has enabled you to kind of galvanize in a way that served you in your career. Has there been a time, though, where your sense of self has felt threatened, and how did having that galvanization serve you?
At a certain time, when I was about, I'd say 9 or so, I began to realise that I was sexually attracted to people of my own gender. And I knew at the time that that was something that was not a good career move, and that I should be thoroughly ashamed of myself. This went on for some time, but it happened that my growing up coincided with some research that was done in the United States by Alfred Kinsey. And Kinsey's research, he'd been a big expert on bees. He'd spent all his life studying bees. And then he suddenly decided that he was bored with bees and he wanted to study human beings.
The birds and the bees.
And so it was a natural enough decision, but very few people had explored scientifically the sexual lives of human beings. Anyway, Kinsey did. It was a sensation at the time, back in the 1940s, and it was widely reported in Australia. And so I could never quite take seriously the view that society was trying to batter me with, that I should be thoroughly ashamed of myself. And I wasn't ashamed of myself. But that required certain strength from loving family, loving parents and siblings, and also strength from knowledge and from scientific knowledge, which came to me in the case of Dr. Kinsey through the media reports of his research, his reports and his discoveries. And therefore I still felt rather self-confident about myself, and I thought, well, if other people don't like me, well, that's their problem. It's not my problem. But it was a very hard thing on people whose moorings were not as strong as mine, because I had very loving family, very strong home life. I went to church on the weekends, and I had a good upbringing. And yet my parents were never battering me to try and make me do better than I could. They were just supportive, loving, but not cruelly ambitious as some parents are. They were just supportive, and they knew I would do my best, and I did, and still am doing my best.
It's a lovely notion. It's a lovely story about how your sense of self and your mooring, you know, those anchors has served you from the bench, I imagine, and in general life, you would have observed kind of the consequences in others when that's not apparent.
Yes, I've seen that, and in fact, when I was appointed to the High Court of Australia, I was invited by the collective judges of Australia to come to a conference in Brisbane and to talk on any subject I liked. They said, you're new to the High Court of Australia, so you got a clean slate, you can do whatever you like. And I'd just come back from Canada, and I'd attended a judges' conference there, and the Canadians are much more touchy-feely than Australians are, and at the conference they had a session on judicial stress. And that was something which I'd never heard discussed in Australia. And so I said, I'm going to talk about stress in the judiciary. And that made them very stressed, or the organisers were extremely stressed that I was coming along, and instead of talking about the latest theories of contract law or new methods of detection for crime to prevent unjust convictions, I wanted to talk about a touchy-feely subject of stress, which was being discussed in Canada, so I thought it's time it be discussed in Australia. But when I went to give my talk on that subject, they'd invited another judge in Queensland, a very distinguished and able judge, who was an appeal judge, and he came along to criticise me. But he blamed his wife. I thought that was very interesting. He said, my wife told me when I was leaving, and I told her what I was going to do, that judges don't even begin to know what stress is. When they come into the room, everybody stands up. When they tell a joke, everybody is compulsorily required to laugh, and everybody's bowing and scraping to them. So don't go there talking about stress. Get on, pull your socks up and get on with your job. But he said that, I said my piece, and I wrote this up later in the Australian Law Journal. It became something of a standard source of conferences, and now you can't go to a judge's conference without people, or a legal conference, without people talking about stress, and I think that's a good thing. Maybe you have to feel very strong in yourself to speak about stress, or to speak about sexual variation, or to speak about a different culture that you might come from, or the particular problems of being a woman in the law and in the judiciary, or the issues of Indigenous people, First Nations people. Difference and variety is the essence of humanity, and Charles Darwin pointed out that the reason for evolution was not because everybody was the same, but because there occurred in the human species and in other animal species and plant species variations. The rule of variation is chapter 4 of Charles Dickens's book Origin of Species, and it's very important to feel comfortable with the fact that there are variations, and so long as they're not hurtful to other human beings, they are just part of the course of nature. And if they're part of the course of nature, they have a purpose. And when you realise all that, you just get on with your life and do the best you can with it.
I think that's really important, that, you know, that sense of being confident in yourself. It's not just about you and your pathway. It's also about holding space for other people to be themselves. Would you agree with that statement?
I do, and in fact one of the problems of the world we live in now is that a lot of people have an obsession about a particular thing. You know, I know some gay people who only want to talk about gay rights, or some women who only want to talk about feminist legal theories and so on, or people of colour who want to talk about race. And they don't really realise the similarity of the things that beset them and that sometimes afflict them. And so I always try to tell students and audiences, especially young law students, when I was at law school, I never put my hand up to ask why women had unequal rights in the law, in areas like divorce in those days, or why we had the White Australia policy to prevent people of different races coming to Australia, or we didn't recognise the land rights of the Indigenous people. I never asked a question about that. And of course I never asked a question about why we locked up gay people just for searching for love and friendship and a sexual life. So the lesson of my life basically is you can be confident and self-assured and you can stand up for what you believe, but we've all got to learn from others and learn about the problems of people who are often minorities, and they suffer because they're a bit different. And there's something infantile in being suspicious of difference. We should embrace it because it's one of the wonderful features of human life, and it's, as Darwin taught, it's the reason why we continue to evolve. Difference, not sameness.
As you were sort of going through those different demographics and different groups and sort of touched briefly on this notion of labeling oneself as a particular, in a particular category, I'm curious to your opinion of, do we also have a collective self or collective selves, and how do we relate to that collective self as an individual and manage that tension between the group and the self, now individuality, and maintaining our own agency as we belong to different things?
Well, all of us have various groups, community groups, in which we emerge in our life and in which we practice work. And the legal profession and the judiciary are very cohesive areas of occupation, and most specialist professions have very strong sense of self. To some extent, these are protective of obedience to things that are important for the protection of clients and others who are outside the group. But I discovered in the course of my development that it's also important for a judge not to subsume their own personal views in the community views or in even the judicial community's view. One of the great strengths, I think, is of our judicial tradition is that it's not corrupted, and ultimately a judge has to say what he or she thinks is the case, even though others in the judiciary may disagree and may ultimately correct them from the point of view of what is the law. But independence of the pressures of the group is something I learned very much when I was young, discovering my sexuality. The group was really nasty, and in some countries it still is, and in some parts of our society. If you're a minority, if you're a minority indigenous person, or if you're a minority race, or have a different culture or religion, or disability, these are reasons why people try to force you to fit into their idea, their stereotype. But the essence of freedom is to stand up for what you believe and to express it, and to do so strongly. If you're a judge, to say it even if other judges don't agree with you, because we have mechanisms for correcting error, but integrity involves truthfulness, and truthfulness involves searching into yourself for what is the correct and lawful answer to the particular problem that's presented to you as a judge.
I'm suddenly disappointed that no one's asked you about this topic before in your career. Before we conclude, 100 years ago when I was at law school, you were quite famous among our cohort for being on the wrong side of the majority, but the right side of history. And then as we, as most law students do, come to know and love your commentary and your decisions. You're famous for some unpredictable commentary at times. Do you have anything for us today of that ilk?
Well, of course, I've got lots of things that I can talk on for hours about issues in our world today, issues of Ukraine, issues of the environment, issues of pandemics and the next pandemic just around the corner. But an issue that is really concerning me, and to some extent it's presented by the Ukraine problem, and it's concerning, I would think, most people today that go home and look at the television and see the terrible death and destruction that is occurring, and is the issue of nuclear weapons. Nobody wants to talk about that subject, and everybody thinks, oh, well, we've survived 70 years without anybody using nuclear weapons, therefore we don't have anything to worry about. But I think we do have something to worry about. We have to worry about the existence, the continued existence of the human species with its marvellous rationality, its insight into self, its insight into our world and into our universe. But all of that could be swept away in a matter of days by the weapons that are now available. And boys with toys are a problem. And therefore, it's really important for all Australians, I think, and people everywhere to get behind a procedure for the purpose of taking very seriously the dangers of nuclear weapons. There was a small group in Melbourne that was formed. It was a committee against nuclear weapons, and it had professors but ordinary citizens in it. Didn't get much support from politicians on either side or from government, but it set up this group, ICAN, and this group wouldn't give up, and they went to the United Nations. They formulated a treaty for the purpose of banning nuclear weapons. They were opposed by the big countries with nuclear weapons, but gradually, by sheer persistence, this little group formed in Melbourne became big enough and strong enough and supported enough by the world community that it gathered the number of states that were necessary to adopt a treaty and put it into international law. Now, that doesn't solve the problem, but it begins the dialogue that will ultimately, I hope, solve the problem before we destroy ourselves. The future of the human species and all the beauties of the music of J.S. Bach and the paintings and the Shakespeare and the poets, all of that could just be swept away. And it's very important, therefore, that we think about it, talk about it, and do what that group in Melbourne did. Organise ourselves, get together, do the unusual, do what people say is impossible, dream the impossible dream, seriously. And so that would be my challenge. Don't just accept things that are bad and dangerous, and nuclear weapons are bad and dangerous.
It was really interesting to hear you speak about your efforts to address stress in the judiciary. And I was wondering if you could speak about the importance of having these frank conversations about mental health in industries that have long hours, that are always on. How does that help the people who are in those jobs?
Well, self-evidently, if something isn't talked about and it's sort of swept under the carpet, that can be a situation in which a lot of injustice can flourish. And that was true when I was growing up in relation to sexuality, but also in relation to Aboriginal rights and the rights of people of different skin colour. These trivial differences in human beings, which were the source of a lot of bad law and unjust law that I never asked about at university. I mean, If somebody with my education and training had never put their hand up to ask about it, well, you can't really be critical of a lot of other people for not having done so. So I think the need is there for us constantly to be asking, what are the things we are not seeing today that people in 50 years' time, 100 years' time, if we have survived, will say, how could you possibly have been so ignorant and so blind and not raised issues? And I think it's true that in busy professional life, you don't get a lot of time to think deeply about these issues, but we need to encourage school children and young people to think about the issues that affect their existence. And once that would have only been done in churches and Sunday school, but now I think increasingly there's an expectation that those with the gift of education and self-questioning will give leadership to the community so that our population and our political leaders take the cue and stand up and ask the questions that I didn't ask when I was young.
Thank you for that. And speaking of issues that fundamentally affect our existence, RiSE and real estate business are two entities that ultimately revolve around the fundamental need for housing. I was wondering if you could offer just some thoughts about the importance of being able to make a home, to have a house as a human right.
Well, undoubtedly having shelter and a house is part of the framework of international human rights. Not far from this office is Martin Place in Sydney, and every night when I finish my work, roughly at about 7 o'clock, I go there and there are a lot of homeless people. Our community, for a rich community, has a lot of homeless people, and many of them have lost out through no fault of their own, or just through bad luck, or through genetic disabilities that they have suffered from when young. And I think it would be a good thing if the real estate industry could spare a thought for those who are not going to be able to turn their harbourside mansion into a massive 131% increase in value over the last 20 years, but who can't find a place to live and who are dependent on handouts. It's really surprising to those who don't know to see how many Australians in this rich country don't have proper shelter, and that's against their human rights, and it's against common humanity and against kindness to one another.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more. Thank you so much for taking the time. That's all I wanted to sort of jump in and ask you. So really appreciate it.
It's a pleasure.
Thanks.